On the East Bench of Colorado City, Arizona, the stronghold of the Polygamist Fundamentalist Church, lies the adult cemetery dedicated to Isaac W. Carling. It's a place where the FLDS prophets are buried, and I'm wondering if the community will ban Warren Jeffs from ever being buried there, a place where their leaders rest. Hey, thanks for joining Profiling Evil, and please make sure you're hitting that like and subscribe button. Ring that darn bell so that you get all of our videos when they're released. This video is part of the Fundamentalist Friday series we've been doing on Profiling Evil, based around Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. Many of the members of this cult have been fleeing to other parts of the country, as directed by their leader, convicted child abuser Warren Jeffs. Now, he proclaimed the area has been poisoned by apostates, people who are not of their faith. Well, today we're looking into the Isaac Carling Cemetery, where most of the adult FLDS members are buried. Today, some former members who have died are also being interred there, something that would have never happened a few years ago. But even today, when a non-member, and this includes those former members or apostates, a non-member of the FLDS Church tries to bury a loved one in the cemetery, it can become contentious. Take the case of a 10-month-old Angel Lee, who was killed when the van her mother was driving collided with a loaded garbage truck. The family, who were not members of the FLDS Church, tried to bury the toddler next to her grandfather, who was a devout member and is buried in the cemetery. The burial was set to occur even as her mother recovered in a hospital bed nearby. Her mother said, quote, "She loved everybody, and she always had a smile for everybody," close quote. It's confusing to say, but love seems to be the thing that's missing from the polygamist community, now that outsiders are gaining ground in the once FLDS-only community. In fact, until the past few years, outsiders, or people who weren't of the fundamental faith tradition, were ostracized and ignored. These so-called apostates, again, people leaving the FLDS Church or people that were never members of the FLDS, still say that they're being shunned by FLDS faithful who seem to ignore the New Testament dictate to love one another. Things were much worse when I was investigating the cult in the late 90s, early 2000s. And you could go back to my other videos where I explained what it was like to come into that community and be threatened as I followed and traveled around. Now, believe it or not, when Angel Lee's family tried to bury her in this cemetery, the father's own brother, the child's uncle, attempted to stop the graveside service, saying it was an abomination. In years gone by, the local police would have supported such a terrible thing. The police also worked under the direction of Warren Jeffs back then, if you remember. But today, though the federal government's disbanded the old police department and a new, more honorable police department is in place. That police department today prevented the FLDS terrorist from interfering with the burial, keeping the guy several hundred yards away from the family. But even with that police effort, 3 members of the FLDS faith, including the cemetery sexton, disrupted the burial by taking pictures and documenting everybody that was in attendance, all in an attempt to harass and frighten the attendees. One person at the graveside memorial told the Deseret News that the men chose to act poorly and disrupt the service. They're bold and they were in your face. This will really blow your mind. The child's grave was dug the night before the memorial service, and when the family arrived in the morning, they discovered that somebody had filled the grave in. So they went and dug a second grave, and they stood there and waited until the body was lowered in, covering it with dirt and hoping it would remain undisturbed. All the while, Members of the FLDS stronghold threatened the child's family that they would be charged with trespassing and vandalism. In the old days, that might have actually happened, but this new police chief isn't threatened by the self-proclaimed thugs that still roam this community. Some people think that the Isaac W. Carling Cemetery should be actually split into two sections, an FLDS area and a non-FLDS section. This doesn't make sense to the families who have left the cult, but say they still want to be buried by loved ones who preceded them in death. In another example of the brewing conflict over this cemetery, another guy named Isaac Weiler told the Deseret News about a time in which he was blocked from attending the graveside service of his father-in-law. He said, quote, "The FLDS people were out in the parking lot and they told me it was private property and that they would have me arrested if I tried to go to the funeral," close quote. Weiler would later say that there is a certain group of callous FLDS faithful who just don't care who they hurt. He hopes the majority might think that the line they've drawn in the sand goes way too far. It's all about those who have sworn obedience to convicted child molester Warren Jeffs and those who hold onto those long-standing FLDS teachings. In this guy's mind, it's not about polygamy, it's about absolute obedience to Warren Jeffs.
Hey everybody, look who I'm hanging out with. And listen, I'm not attending choir practice, but I just wanted to tell you that you need to be watching Profiling Evil YouTube. Don't miss it. I'm telling you, there's something there for you every single time. I never miss. You shouldn't either.
Since some of you might make your way to Short Creek one day, I thought I'd give you a couple of key FLDS graves to look for. In the video I'm showing here, we're going to be driving into the Isaac W. Carling Cemetery. But then we're going to take the drone up to about 400 feet above ground and give you a 360-degree view of this thing in its entirety. You're going to see that many of the graves still look like old pioneer or Western graves with a mound of red soil piled on top of the body and the casket below. Some of the graves have beautiful markers, while others seem to be uncared for. Now, there are two graves that most people seem to be interested in, and they are both former leaders, self-proclaimed prophets of the FLDS community. The most recent is Rulon Jeffs. That's Warren Jeffs' father. This guy died in about 2002, and this imagery is showing his grave close up. Now, if you're going to visit the cemetery, you can refer to the map that I'm going to be posting next week in this big story map. But Rulon Jeffs' grave is on the main road as you enter under the Isaac W. Carling metal archway into the cemetery. It's located on the 7th segment of graves on the left, or the north end of the cemetery. Now, if you've reached the monument in the middle of the road, you've gone too far. So go back a couple of rows, and you should be right in the right spot. Now, 2 segments east of Rulon Jeffs' grave, and just a few feet to the north, is Leroy Johnson's grave. He was the leader before Rulon Jeffs, and both leaders have large but fairly modest headstones. I think they're incredibly hard to read and not that good looking. Now, this map shows you the entire cemetery, and it gives you a much better idea of where those graves are located if you're trying to find them. Sam Zinning-Wyson of the YouTube channel Growing Up in Polygamy and I spent some time in the cemetery, reflecting on his family members who are buried there, along with many other of the FLDS faithful. Now listen, I hope you'll go over to Sam and Melissa's channel and subscribe to it. Now, let's catch up on the conversation that Sam and I had as we looked over all these graves.
Everybody, I'm Mike from Profiling Evil.
And I'm Sam from Growing Up in Polygamy.
You know, we're wrapping up this tour of Hilldale, Colorado City, Sam, and I got to tell you, it's just really been a joy for me to spend time with you, talk about things, not only from my perspective, but to hear your perspective on things growing up. It's got to be a little surreal to come back and have a different mindset that you had as a kid.
It is very surreal, and we're currently standing in the cemetery where I have a lot of loved ones buried, and it is definitely surreal, and it brings back so many memories, and especially for those that are buried here, the life that they lived. It's definitely been a great journey, and I appreciate you coming out here with me and going throughout the community and talking about these experiences.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I mean, I can't think of a more fitting place to end our discussion than in a cemetery. And we actually, folks, chose not to go to the tomb or the grave of Rulin Allred or Johnson or any of the other leaders that have been a part of the FLDS history, but more to just talk about the fact that the cemetery has some pretty unique things as well. Now, your family's buried here, and in this video that we took with the drone, looking at the area and kind of passing by the graves, one thing that just continues to stick out in my mind is the fact that this is unlike any other cemetery where all the graves have a mound of dirt over the top of them.
Yes.
And I wondered what your thoughts were growing up in the community. Probably never even thought about it, but
Well, I thought about it, but I assumed it was normal. Honestly, I expected every graveyard to have mounds of dirt where the person was buried, and I assumed that it was just to give a very obvious, I guess, indication of where the grave site was. Not all of these grave sites have a big plaque or a big tombstone of some kind, and so I assumed it was a kind of like a marker.
yeah, well, it does become actually a marker, doesn't it? Again.
Many people have wondered about the mounds of dirt that are piled over the body and casket, as you've seen in the video clip that I was just showing. We discussed Sam's thoughts around this phenomenon, and I thought that I'd share some things that I learned when looking into this. So let's catch that part of the discussion.
In fact, the Salt Lake Tribune actually ran an article about this very question.
Oh.
And they came up with a couple of things and couldn't answer the question either. But the answers they came up with were kind of twofold. One was that there is a question about whether it had something to do with pioneer heritage and the fact that they buried this way. It's out in the middle of nowhere, and it's just the way things were done. Another angle was, I think, one that makes a whole lot more sense to me, and that is that it just makes perfect sense. If you're going to put a coffin in the ground after you've removed dirt, there's going to be excess dirt.
Where do you put the dirt? Hey, that might be exactly what it was all about. And maybe it started because of that, and then from then on they said, hey, this is perfect. Let's just do this for all of the graves.
Yeah, it's interesting as you drive around through the cemetery, and we're going to give you a shot of this in just a moment, folks, but even in some areas, the family members who have survived this person that's deceased have even gone as far as piling it with rocks. And that goes back in what I've been able to uncover in history, and again, it's all folklore history, but it goes back to the plains when they used to bury people on the plains, and they were so fearful of the wolves or other animals digging them up and eating their loved ones that they started putting rocks on to make it just that much more difficult.
And you see that today. You see that in some grave sites as well, where they still do that today.
Yeah, a lot of these graves, they've started putting rock on top of the graves themselves.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So it kind of gives us a little insight into some of the behavior of the people as they're burying them and the way they're making decisions.
Wow. There was in my family, a recent accident and tragedy where one of my older brothers and his wife and child all were killed in a plane crash.
Oh,
and
my
they're
goodness.
buried just down here. And so that was a very sudden and unfortunate accident that was very hard for the family.
I am so sorry to hear that.
So he actually was no longer a part of the FLDS church, and his wife also came from the FLDS church, and both of them had left and they were still buried here. So that goes to show that there is still that possibility, I guess, that if you were raised in the church, you still can be buried here.
Well, that wraps up our discussion of the Isaac W. Carling Memorial Cemetery and the place where the revered prophets of the FLDS are buried. And that leaves me with my question for this video and each of you. Do you think Warren Jeffs will want to be buried where the other prophets have been buried? And do you think the FLDS people will even allow this to happen? I'm going to be watching for your comments down below, and I hope you'll be kind to one another and professional as you put forth your thoughts. Now, next week, I'm going to share with you the FLDS story map, complete with content that you haven't seen before. I'm also going to be joined by Sam and Melissa from the podcast Growing Up in Polygamy. You're not going to want to miss this live episode, so please make sure that you've got the notifications turned on so that you don't miss a thing. And if you like audio podcasts, make sure you've signed up with Profiling Evil Podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. Remember that you can find Profiling Evil on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And check us out at profilingevil.com, where you can sign up for the BOLO, our digital newsletter. It's going out right now, but only those who have signed up are going to get a copy of it. And if you're considering going to CrimeCon, before you register, make sure you get the Profiling Evil code for a discount on your registration. I hope I'll see you there. Hey, from all of us at Profiling Evil, thanks so much for your support. And we'll see you soon at the next crime scene.